Hello and welcome back to HEMA Fight Breakdowns. Today we're going to be talking about this longsword exchange. And in particular, we're going to talk about the thing that happened right at the end, which is right after fighter on the right's thrust missed, fighter on the left goes for a left Zwerch, but it gets gumped up in this ox position and doesn't quite finish all the way over. And the reason I want to talk about that is two things. The first is to talk about this sort of inherent disadvantage to the left Zwerch, which I'm a big fan of the left Zwerch, and I don't think it has many disadvantages, but this is one of them. And to also highlight why a situation that I think a lot of people would look at and say, oh, well, the right Zwerch is the answer, isn't always the clearest answer. So the first thing we're going to look at here is right as this thrust goes in, you see a rather flat, like flicking kind of thrust that looks like it might have just tapped the front of the mask, but certainly would have been flat and doesn't gain any purchase. But the other important thing to look at here is that this is a very heavily committed forward thrust, but so is this parry. This parry from the fighter on the left, kind of, in a lot of ways, actually looks like they might have been going for their own thrust at the same time, and they simply met in the middle, displaced each other, and went over each other's shoulders. But the result is that this cron parry shoves fighter on the right's thrust all the way up into the air. And this is the position now where 90% of people are going to start Zwerching. Fighter on the right has their hands all the way extended. They're not in a cron position. They're not really in a great spot to throw any kind of cut or thrust. And again, that forward momentum is still carrying them forward there. Similarly, fighter on the left, who's missed their own thrust, has pivoted up into this cron parry and has kept themselves safe, but they're still being carried forward. And it's important to remember that because this forward momentum, in a lot of ways, is what makes the right Zwerch such a problematic action from this position. A lot of people would look at this and go, oh, well, the right Zwerch is free, basically. You're on the right side of the bind, so there's nothing in the way of your sword. You're already in cron, so your thumb's already on the shield. You're in a perfect position just to pull your left hand up and tilt your right hand down and just drive that tip straight into your opponent's torso. And that torso area is completely open. Not only is it open, but the hands and the sword that are going to defend that area are all the way up in the upper right quadrant of this person, which means they'd have to take them all the way from their upper right, all the way down to their lower left, and in a position where they're still advancing forward, they still don't quite have their feet under them, and where they have to pull their hands not just down and left, but in and left to get them as close to their hip as humanly possible, with just a hope of parrying that right Zwerch. So again, you think, oh, well, this is a perfect option. But the problem is that when you throw a right Zwerch, your right arm has to be all the way forward. And similarly, you have been stepping forward with your parry, presumably, and your opponent certainly has been stepping forward very heavily with their thrust. And what can happen is watch this elbow here and watch how far forward and over to the left it ends up just before this left Zwerch can even be thrown. That's a lot of distance traveled, and that's a lot of space taken up. So if you want to imagine that this person's elbow stayed right about here to throw that right Zwerch, you'll see that this other person's elbow gets in the way before that Zwerch even lands. And the problem with throwing right Zwerchs a lot of the time is that your elbows clash. Your forearms smash right into each other. And even though this is a very short distance to travel and it's a completely open target, you'll find that you're getting your Zwerch stuffed all the time because your arm just has nowhere to go. It gets pushed right back into your head, and it ends up killing all of the momentum and the rotation that you would normally need to throw a proper right Zwerch. So instead of doing that, they throw the left Zwerch. But there's another problem. Just like we were talking about earlier with this being on the right side of the bind, what that means is that in order to throw the left Zwerch, well, you have to get out from the right side of this bind. And the fighter on the right here does something very intelligent with their blade. Right after they miss their thrust, they dip their point all the way down to about the level of the top of their opponent's head. And what that means is crossing that body line over to that left Zwerch becomes almost impossible. For reference here, when you throw your left Zwerch and you're on the right side of a bind, it's inevitable that you have to cross behind the back of your own head in order to get your tip and the strong of your blade over around to the side where you can actually properly throw that technique. If you try to just push your blade over to the left side here to throw that Zwerch out, it's going to get even more tied up than it is normally. So you dip it behind your head to try to give yourself the space and disconnect the bind so that you can open up that, that entire area for yourself where the other person is just desperately trying to parry it. Despite the fact that it's not as open looking as over here, technically the side of the head and the top of the shoulder are just as open on the left side. But by dipping the tip and getting the sword in the way there, you basically ensure that there's no option for that Zwerch to make it all the way around. Because if you basically just dip your point down and plant it even on the top of the head or the top of the shoulder, it's going to get stuck on this Zwerch as it comes around. And as long as you keep your ox high here, you can just sit there and wait for that Zwerch to get stuck in your blade. And then you can worry about disconnecting the blade, taking advantage of your low position there, and, throwing something else. So if we watch this back again one more time, you almost see the decision-making going through each fighter's head. You see this missed thrust, and you see this person go, oh, crap. Well, I'm going to get Zwerched, and there's only really one Zwerch that I need to worry about if I close this distance, and it's the left Zwerch. So I'm going to dip my point all the way down here. At the exact same time, you see this person think, oh, well, maybe I can throw that Zwerch to just open up this body, and you see them pull their tip back all the way down and away to try to race their opponent's sword to that closed off section in an attempt to get out of the way of the blade that unfortunately got stuck there anyway. So it's a pretty high level adaptation, and it's a pretty difficult thing to do, to know that when you miss a thrust that someone is going to throw that very specific left Zwerch. But if you break it down step by step, it's actually not as complicated or as, future sight needed, to pull this off. All you really need to know is that whenever you miss a thrust, your opponent is almost inevitably going to try to Zwerch you. And that the one thing that you can do to prevent both of those Zwerchs from coming at you is to take your right elbow, if you're right-handed, and slam it into their lead elbow as quickly as you can in an attempt to stuff the lead Zwerch, or in this case, the right Zwerch, and then to dip your tip down over the back shoulder, or just at least to the level of the head of your opponent, so that if you do both of these things at once, you can prevent both Zwerchs from having a viable path to their target, and you can keep yourself safe for the one tempo you need to get into a new position and figure out the rest of the fight. That's going to be it for today. If you'd like to see your own footage featured on the channel, feel free to send an email over at HEMAFightBreakdowns@gmail.com, and I hope to see you next time.